Welcome to Michigan's WW1 Centennial News Report for October 2018. Sergeant Alvin C York's Michigan Connection. Sergeant Alvin C York was one of the most decorated soldiers of the First World War. During this program, we'll look at Sergeant Alvin C York and his Michigan Connection. The State Report, October 2018. On October 1st, in Chicago, at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, there was an all-states caucus. Representing Michigan was Dennis Skupinski, chairman of Michigan's WW1 Centennial Commission. He is pictured here with Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Pritzker and chairman of the WW1 Centennial Commission, Terry Hanby. On Friday, October 5th at 10 a.m. at the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, the Michigan WW1 Centennial Commission met and discussed the following items. The Capitol bell ringing ceremony taking place on Thursday, November 8th at 12 noon in the Capitol building. The Detroit Veterans Day Parade on November 11th at 11 a.m. The Bells of Peace bell ringing ceremony on November 11th at 11 a.m. We're asking all Americans across the nation to ring the bells of peace in remembrance of those who served and sacrificed in the war that changed the world. Locally, please contact Jerry Benson at the phone number and email above. To learn more about Michigan's WW1 Centennial or find out about events going on around the state, go to ww1cc.org/Michigan for the latest information on Michigan's WW1 Centennial. 1 century ago, October 1918. On October 1st, 1918, Arab forces under T.E. Lawrence captured Damascus. During the month of October 1918, the U.S. Army, American Expeditionary Force in France, was involved in the largest operation in the history of the U.S. Army. Over 1.2 million men were involved in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. On October 2nd, 1918, elements of the 77th Division, 308th Infantry Regiment advanced as part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive into the Argonne Forest. Major Charles Whittlesey led the battalion. Elements to the left and the right of them stalled while the 77th Division continued to advance until they were surrounded by German soldiers. For 6 days, from October 2nd until October 8th, the lost battalion was surrounded by German soldiers. Unable to get supplies or water, the men suffered greatly. On October 2nd, 554 soldiers entered the Argonne Forest. On October 8th, when the lost battalion was rescued, they had 197 that were killed in action, 150 were missing or taken prisoner, and 194 survivors. On October 6, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson receives a note from Germany, and on October 7, 1918, he receives a note from the Austro-Hungarian Empire proposing an armistice which will end the World War. On October 8, 1918, Sergeant Alvin York single-handedly attacks a German machine gun nest, killing at least 25 and capturing 132 Germans. Also on October 8, 1918, the British Commonwealth forces begin the Second Battle of Cambrai. And President Wilson replies to the German note about the armistice and demands an evacuation of occupied territories as the first condition before talking about an armistice. On October 20th, 1918, in order to secure an armistice, Germany agrees to further concessions. On October 26, 1918, Germany's Supreme Commander, General Erich Ludendorff, resigns, protesting the terms to which the German government has agreed to negotiate the armistice. On October 28, 1918, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire breaks up, Czechoslovakia gains its independence. On October 29, 1918, German sailors refused to obey orders to fight the British naval forces and later revolt in the naval ports of Wilhelmshaven, beginning the German Revolution. On October 30, 1918, Turkey signs an armistice with the Allies, agreeing to end hostilities at noon on October 31st. October 31st, 1918, the Spanish flu kills 21,000 people in the United States during the last week. Sergeant Alvin C York, for his actions on October 8, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, became one of America's most decorated heroes, winning the Congressional Medal of Honor plus several other medals. He attacked a German machine gun nest, killing at least 25 German soldiers, capturing one German machine gun, and capturing 132 German prisoners. What makes the Sergeant York story so unusual is that he started the war as a conscientious objector. In 1914, he had an experience that converted him to the Church of Christ and Christian Union. He filed for conscientious objector status on the grounds that his religious denomination forbade violence. Persuaded that religion was not incompatible with military service, York joined the 82nd Division and went to France in 1918. On October 8th, Corporal York was one of 17 soldiers in a group that infiltrated the German lines to silence a machine gun nest. After the initial attack, Corporal York was the highest-ranking soldier in the group, so he took charge. This is how Sergeant York described his action. As soon as the machine guns opened fire on me, I began to exchange shots with them. There were over 30 of them in continuous action, and all I could do was to touch the Germans off just as fast as I could. I was sharpshooting. All the time I kept yelling at them to come down. I didn't want to kill any more than I had to. But it was they or I, and I was giving them the best I had. The Michigan connection to Sergeant Alvin C. York was his grandfather, William H. Harrington, who, during the fall of 1863, enlisted in the 11th Michigan Cavalry that was being organized in Kalamazoo and Detroit. He enlisted from Sheridan, Michigan, which is in Montcalm County. Besides William H. Harrington, age 18, there were 3 other men from Sheridan who enlisted in the 11th Michigan Cavalry, Company A. They were Ashley H. Willard, age 28, Peter Fischel, age 20, and Uriah D. Streeter, age 19. The 11th Michigan Cavalry Regiment was part of General George Stoneman's campaign into eastern Tennessee, western Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. William H. Harrington, Sergeant York's grandfather, was mustered in September 23, 1863, and deserted in Prestonburg, Kentucky, September 12, 1864. The 11th Michigan Cavalry began their campaign in June of 1864 in Kentucky. By September, young William H. Harrington decided he had enough of war. He left the U.S. Army as a deserter and changed his name to William H. Brooks. Brooks was his mother's maiden name. At Pall Mall, Tennessee, he fell in love with Nancy Pyle, daughter of Elijah Pyle and granddaughter of the renowned Conrad Pyle. Young Brooks had deserted the Army and declared that the only other conquest of the South that he was interested in making was the conquest of Nancy Pyle. William and Nancy Brooks had been married about 2 years and had a daughter born to them, when an old feud flared up with a man named Press Huff, who William Brooks promptly killed. Brooks then fled the country knowing that Huff's friends would soon be after him to avenge his death. Several months later, his wife Nancy and their daughter also disappeared. Many months passed, and finally a letter came from Nancy to her family. It had been intercepted by Huff's friends, and the Brooks family was located in a logging camp near St. John's, Michigan. Extradition papers and warrants were prepared, and Huff's former business partner was sent to Michigan to return with William Brooks to Jamestown, where he was lodged in the county jail. William H. Brooks never got a trial by law. The next night, a band of men rode up to Jamestown, took him from jail, and tied a rope around his feet, unbridled a horse, tied the other end of rope around a horse's tail, and fired a shot to scare the horse. As the horse ran down the road dragging William Brooks, men rode behind him, firing bullets into his squirming body until he was dead. William Brooks' widow, Nancy, moved back to Pell Mell, Tennessee. Her daughter, Mary, eventually married William York when she was 15 years old. The couple would have 11 children. The third oldest would be Alvin C York. I recently had a chance to sit down and talk with Colonel Gerald York, grandson of Sergeant Alvin C York. He told me stories about Alvin York and also a sword that was given to his great-great-grandfather, William H. Brooks, by his commanding officer during the Civil War.
I'm Gerald York, retired U.S. Army Colonel, and the grandson of Sergeant Alvin C. York. And I'm also the chairman of the Sergeant York Patriotic Foundation, which we, at this time, are building the Sergeant York Center for Peace and Valor. When my grandfather came back from World War I, he realized he was at a distinct disadvantage because of his education. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to bring education to the mountain children. And so his goal was to go raise money, build a high school. He first approached the local folks. They did not want a high school. They didn't want their kids going to school 9 months out of the year because they used them to work on the farm. So he ran into a lot of opposition of building the high school. He ended up going around the country. He told me one time he went to all 48 states to raise money, and raised enough money that he built a school. He got 400 acres and built a high school for the mountain children. He bought the school buses, he hired the drivers, he paid the gas, he paid all the utilities. He basically funded the whole school. He built it in 1926, opened in end of 26, beginning of 27, and he ran it himself for about 10 years. At one point, the local folks who did not want a high school went to the state of Tennessee and said, he has the equivalent of a third grade education. He can't be running a high school. He doesn't have an education himself. So the state of Tennessee approached him and said, we're going to have to work something out. He told the state if they would run the high school, then he would give it to the state. He'd give them the school buses, he'd give them the 400 acres, as well as the building. So they agreed to it, and to their credit, to this day, it's still a state-supported school. My grandfather toured all the way up through until he had his stroke in '54. In the '30s, he was touring and up in the Ohio area, and had a testament with him. He actually gave that to one of the individuals that was there for his talk, who was going either in the military or going in the military. And that family contacted us recently and said, we have the Bible that your grandfather gave to our grandfather, and we would like to give it back if it'll go on display. And so we have it, and it's actually on display at his home, which is a museum now. My grandfather actually gave me a sword when I was a young teenager, and said that it had come from William Brooks, who had come down from Michigan. And I'm not sure when he got the sword, or if it was a trip back. I'm not sure when he got the sword, but he had brought it down and actually had given it to one of my grandfather's relatives, and my grandfather ended up with it. And so probably around late 50s, early 60s, he actually gave it to me because I was into that kind of thing and loved all the artifacts, and so he gave that to me to use. Uh, the state of Tennessee a few years ago decided to tear the original building down that my grandfather had built. They actually built a new building for the school, and so the original building that he had built, the school wanted to tear it down, and make a parking lot. So the family and the Sergeant York Patriotic Foundation got together and lobbied, and it took us about 6 or 7 years, but we finally got the title to the school and the grounds that it sits on. And we're in the process of renovating it. We've raised and spent about $2.4 million to get it into stabilization, and now we're turning it into the Sergeant York Center for Peace and Valor. My grandfather's dream and his goal was to have something after high school. So we've talked with a couple of universities in Tennessee, Roane State and Tennessee Tech, and they have agreed to have classes there. So we're looking at raising about $15 million to completely restore the building, have it for veterans, have it for youth, and also have classes, which goes along with his dream of more education. And he was always about doing things for veterans and young people. Yeah. My grandfather never really talked to the family about the war. The things I heard him say was when people would visit him. My uncle and I would set up with him in the hospital. He had a stroke in '54, passed away in '64, and was in the hospital several times, especially the last 2 or 3 years of his life. And my grandmother didn't want to leave him by himself, so my uncle and I would set up with him at night. And he would get visitors, and they would ask him questions. And one of the things I remember is somebody asked him, "How did you have enough ammunition? You had your basic load. How'd you have enough ammunition?" And he said, "Well, as we were marching in to the battle, people were discarding their ammo." And he said, ammo in Tennessee was scarce and very precious. So I picked up extra ammo. So I had plenty of ammunition because I picked up extra that other folks discarded. And I just read a month or so ago one of his speeches where he said that he actually picked up a rifle and ammunition that someone had gotten wounded or whatever and just left it there. So he had picked up a rifle and ammunition along the way into the battle. He at one point was rushed by 7 men, and so he didn't have enough shells left, didn't have enough to reload in his rifle, so he pulled his pistol out and actually did an old hunting trick that he had of shooting the last one first. He was used to shooting turkeys, and if you shot the first one, the rest of them would scatter off. But if you shot the last one, they would scatter a little bit but stay in formation. And so he shot the last guy and worked his way up. And when he shot the last guy was very close to him. But because he thought he still had 6 guys behind him, he didn't fire his weapon.